And it is a good morning. Did you see that sky? It's beautiful here today. My name is Patricia Mills, and I'm the president of Patricia A. Mills, Inc., an advisory service. But I'm probably better known in this community for being a publisher of Northern Ontario Business and Cirtwill Living magazine. In the media business for 25 years and still very much involved. So I'm very pleased to be here today as your moderator. Thank you to the Chamber for the invitation. I'd like to say, first of all, that we were having a really good debate at our table before we came to the stage, so I think my colleagues up here are well raring to go. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this post-mortem panel discussion on the 2015 federal election. On October 19th, the Liberals won a majority government after the longest and costliest federal election campaign in Canadian history. That same day, Stephen Harper indicated his intention to step down as Conservative leader, ending almost 10 years in power. And I must say, this election was very interesting, especially in the final days. And I was telling a gentleman here on the panel that I can't remember an election that generated so much interest among the 20-something group. I have 2 daughters in 2 universities in 2 parts of Ontario, and they were just wrapped up in Trudeau mania. And it reminded me when I was young, and I was wrapped up in Trudeau mania too. So it's true, it was just deja vu. It was very, very weird. Probably though, according to my daughters, Justin is a hell of a lot better looking than Pierre was. There was a lot of issues that were brought to the forefront. There were a lot of issues that were not brought to the forefront that will come about in the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to talk about some of those today. It was interesting to watch how the election unfolded. The Liberal Party went from a distant third in the polls barely a month before the election to sweeping many parts of Canada, even including spots in Alberta's Conservative strongholds. Today is a very important day. Today is the day that Mr. Trudeau will be sworn in as the country's 23rd Prime Minister, and the day he will appoint his cabinet. And there's been a lot of discussion in the media about the makeup of that cabinet. I think that women are going to have a much larger portfolio than they've ever had in federal politics. It's going to be interesting. We're going to have a combination of novice cabinet ministers and seasoned cabinet ministers and regional representation. And having said that, I don't think the North will have a cabinet minister, but we'll certainly have a lot of support in the cabinet. So it's fitting for us to be here this morning discussing what's next and looking at how the new government will set the tone for the future. And this is meant to be an interactive session. We'll begin with the introduction of the panelists and their opening remarks, and we'll then move to a moderated Q&A. In the panel discussion, we will discuss the future, nation, province, and our region, and we will discuss what issues are important to press in light of the new government. We've sectioned off time for audience questions, so we encourage you to participate. And take notes on your little pads there as we're going along. And I just caught the eye of Floyd Logren, and I should tell you that when Floyd was the finance minister, and with the NDP government, the provincial NDP government, I was in Queen's Park and documented that as a reporter for Northern Life. And I was shoved off the stage by Christy Blanchford. I don't know if you know her, but she's a well-known national columnist, because she wanted to get closer to Floyd. And I was taking her space. Just reminding me of watching me sit there. I would like to extend a special welcome to our guests, Hendrik Brakel from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Karl Baldauf from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and Charles Cirtwill from the Northern Policy Institute. Nice. Thank you for being with us today. Before introductions, we would also like this opportunity to thank both Paul Lefebvre and Mark Serret on their election as members of Parliament for Sudbury Nickel Belt. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here today. They had a pressing engagement. But I'd love to hear the story when they get back, and I think that Northern Life will probably cover it, what it was like to be there today as the Liberals took over and the new government was sworn in. The Chamber looks forward to working with the new MPs, and of course, MPPs. We've got fully covered here. We're Liberal. a Liberal jurisdiction now. At this time, I'd like to introduce Hendrik. He's the Senior Director of Economic, Financial and Tax Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce of Ottawa. Hendrik is responsible for the development and analysis of policies on economic performance, national competitiveness, and the overall environment of doing business in Canada. I'm going to recommend an iPad for the next, so we can just swipe it. Hendrik joined the Chamber from Export Development Canada, where he was the economist responsible for the United States, Europe, and Canada. Please help me welcome Hendrik.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Patricia. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here today. And what extraordinary timing, my goodness, the swearing-in ceremony starts at 9 a.m. We were joking before the event that if you want to put the panelists on the spot, ask us about our who do you think is going to be cabinet picks or who's going to be Minister of Finance, and you can check on your smartphone at 10 o'clock and see if we got it right or not. But speaking of getting things right and getting it wrong, I'm going to start. Nobody thought it would be a majority. Absolutely no one. On September 30th, the Nanos polls showed the Liberals, NDP, and Conservatives 30.1, 30.2, and 30.3. It was dead even. So remember all those tedious articles about, oh my gosh, what will happen if there's a minority in Liberal NDP? What are the powers of the Governor General? What happens if Stephen Harper, the Conservatives, manage to cling to power, but the Prime Minister resigns? All of those things, we were all sure it was a minority. And so why did pollsters and so many experts get it wrong? Well, one of the things they got it right is if you look at the Conservative vote, it basically didn't budge. The Conservatives got 5.7 million votes in 2011. And a few weeks ago, they got 5.7 million again. So if you voted Conservative in the last election, you voted Conservative in this election. Their base stayed absolutely loyal. The big change was in the Liberals. Their vote shot up 150%. We've never seen this, from 2.7 million to 6.8 million. An additional 4.1 million voters came out and voted for the Liberals. Where did they come from? Well, firstly, we have to shed a tear for the NDP. This was very sad. There was some strategic voting as people moved, but it was 1 million votes that went from NDP to Liberal. In fact, it was 3.1 million voters that hadn't come out to the polls before. So the turnout ratio in Canada went from 58% to 69% as 3 million people came out to vote. Now, why is that? This is a hard question. I'd love to hear from the audience and from some of our other panelists. Was it Trudeau mania? Or was it Harperphobia? And I have to say, I'm not totally convinced that it's Trudeau mania. I have never seen Canadians so angry, so wanting change. I think in some ways the Americans have term limits, 2 terms and then there's a change. I think there was a tremendous desire for change in Canada, and I think it really hit the Conservative Party hard. Now I think, given the size of the majority, that Trudeau, there's 2 things. Firstly, Trudeau will enjoy a nice honeymoon. I think people are very happy to see this new Prime Minister, and I think it's good for business. It's good for business to have that predictability of a stable majority government in Canada. The worst would have been a shaky minority of Liberals being pulled to the left by the NDP. And imagine every important bill, every budget that comes through, they have to go out and start deal-making with the NDP. And it maybe be pulled to the left on issues like corporate taxes or the Trans-Pacific Partnership or other barbaric economic practices. So what we're really happy is that there's a stable majority that gives the Liberal government the ability to enact their legislation. And they've got a huge amount on their agenda right away. And we'll talk about that later, but that's just for the intros. We're pretty excited about having a government.
It's good to be excited. Karl Baldauf is the Vice President of Policy and Government Relations at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and Karl joined the Ontario Chamber in May 2015 as Vice President of Policy and Government Relations. He holds over a decade of experience working in advocacy and communications in the public and private sectors, as well as in politics and with stakeholder organizations. Karl worked for 2 provincial cabinet ministers, Ontario's leader of the opposition, and most recently with Canada's largest PR firm. Throughout his career, I guess he started at 10, he has worked with the province's leading officials in politics and at the senior most executive levels to craft policy that supports Ontario's business community. Karl, thanks for coming in from Toronto to be with us today. The floor is yours.
We're good? Okay, thank you, my pleasure. So it was a remarkable turn of events, as you say. Like I said, no one would have predicted this. But I actually believe that the canary in the coal mine for the change that happened and the support that the Liberals found at the expense of the NDP, that canary actually started here in Sudbury. Several months ago, of course, it's not news to anyone here about the disaffection of MP Glenn Thibault at the time. And everyone was wondering, what would he be doing going down to provincial politics, leaving the NDP ranks, especially when they were excelling in the polls. There was so much confidence behind Tom Mulcair, who presented himself as a very capable, intelligent individual. What would he be doing? What is that MP Thibault thinking? And what we've realized is that his thinking, which is this is an individual I can't work with, and he's not going to be Prime Minister, that notion is one that I think Canadians picked up on as the campaign went on. Yes, Mulcair, very capable, very intelligent, but that emotional connection that he lacked is one that Trudeau made up for in droves. So, you know, we can talk about policy, but I think personality is such a key part of politics. People were done with the lack of connection that they had with Harper. And if that was the case, the next person that you go to would not be somebody like Mulcair, who perhaps had a difficulty connecting with people at a personal level. It's Justin Trudeau, who had an emotional quotient unlike I think anyone I've ever seen in Canadian politics. So that's that. A large swing. I come from Toronto, and you know there are core urban seats in Toronto. Never would have expected would have gone to the Liberal Party because we've had very capable MPs like Peggy Nash and Andrew Cash and others there. But here we are now with a strong and stable majority Liberal government. And the Ontario Chamber of Commerce actually throughout the election campaign put out 2 reports that tried to draw attention to the unique economic policy issues that were necessary for the federal parties to address that specifically affect Ontario. In the first piece that we put out called In Focus, which has been distributed to many of you at your tables, what we talked about were some key things that needed to be addressed from a principle level, if not a policy level. We talked about the importance of cooperation. Here in Ontario, under the Harper government and under the Wynne government, there has been a lack of cooperation between the 2 levels of government. And whatever your politics, that doesn't do any of us any good. So, you know, we've talked a lot about the ORPP, the pension plan in Ontario, and the federal Conservative government refused to utilize the administrative functions that it oversees to help collect the money that would be given out as part of the ORPP, and this would have an eventual cost in tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that Ontarians would have to make up for, simply because the Harper Conservative government was ideologically against ORPP. Now, you can be against the ORPP, and certainly the Chamber has spoken out against it, but refusing to collect that money, if the provincial government had a mandate to proceed with it, would have cost us all an additional amount of money. So we've emphasized the importance of conversations, harmonization, cooperation between the 2 levels of government. I think we can now expect to see that. We also talked about fixing the fiscal framework. So right now, Ontario hands over $11 billion more to the federal government than it collects. And Ontario is facing a very difficult time economically right now across the province, not just in areas of northern Ontario, but across the province. And so what we've called upon all parties to do during the federal election was to fix that fiscal imbalance. And it remains to be seen how effective the new government will be at addressing that. Today we put out a letter to all the newly elected MPs, and we've called for the return of the mandatory long-form census, which of course helps businesses do planning. We've seen through media reports that that's actually something that will be enacted relatively soon, so we're very happy about that. And one of the other major things that the Ontario Chamber has called for is investments in infrastructure. So the Liberals have set $125 billion over 10 years in infrastructure funding. Everyone's saying that means lots of transit, which has minimum impact on areas outside of the GTA. The truth is that they've said only $20 billion of those $125 billion will be spent in transit, transportation infrastructure. So that means a lot of money for individual communities that perhaps don't have the population density to support transit. So that's good news for places like Sudbury and areas outside of the GTA. But the final thing that I'll say is, in our final report that we issued 2 weeks in advance of the election called Spotlight Ontario, we analyzed each of the parties and their commitments against the priorities we had made earlier in the campaign. And we were disappointed to see that that the parties were not focusing more attention on Northern Ontario. We know that there are unique challenges that Northern Ontario faces. There are specific population challenges, a decreasing population largely throughout the north. We know that there hasn't been sufficient focus on the Ring of Fire, and we know that everyone is talking about everyone that talks about Northern Ontario is frequently only talking about the Ring of Fire when there are so many other issues going on. So we communicated dissatisfaction that there wasn't more focus on Northern Ontario specific issues, and we're hoping that that changes when the new government announces its path forward.
And finally, but not least, is Charles. Charles is the founding president and CEO of the Northern Policy Institute. Charles joined the Northern Policy Institute in September 2013 after 12 years with the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. He's published works focused on government structure and organization, business-government relations, intergovernmental relations, performance measurement, and accountability. He has spoken across Canada and the U.S. on the role of think tanks in society and on the appropriate assessment of government activities. Charles has served as a policy advisor to several political campaigns and has provided nonpartisan advice and direction to provincial and municipal administrations across Canada. Welcome, Charles.
Morning. Does this work? There we go. Okay, so warning number one. I'm a numbers person, so I'm going to throw some numbers at you. So get your pens in hand so you can scribble them down and we can talk about them later. Second off, since the challenge was laid, here are my predictions. In finance, it's either going to be Freeland or it's going to be Scott Bryson. I'm going with Scott primarily because I've known him for a long time, we're personal friends, but I'll take the other one too. First female finance minister in Canadian history, that'd be pretty interesting. There will be a Northern minister, and I think it's going to be my MP, Patty Hyde from Thunder Bay Superior North. So there's two predictions you can test. We'll see how we do. Before the election, there are 10 seats in Northern Ontario. Before the election, how many did the Liberals hold? Does anybody know? None. None. They now hold how many? 7. However, they took 4 of those from either the Greens or the NDP and the other 3 from the Conservatives. So when the question gets asked, was it Trudeau-mania or was it Harperphobia? I think the answer is pretty clear that it was Harperphobia. Not that we're not enthusiastic about Trudeau, not that in particular the youth community is enthusiastic about Trudeau, but frankly, the young people in this country were annoyed with Harper long before Trudeau was even the leader of the Liberal Party. So I think it's pretty clear that that's going on. I love the fact that we're rewriting history only a few weeks after the election, talking about an unpredictable result. The fact is that if you look at the numbers that the pollsters gave us in the week leading up to the election, they were almost bang on in terms of overall percentages. We knew 3 or 4 days before the election who was going to win and that it was going to be a majority. And the fact is that that vote reflected across the country. Anybody but Conservative vote decided about a week and a half before the election that they weren't going to vote NDP, that they were all going to coalesce behind the Liberals. Basically that happened because the NDP supported Quebec demonstrably fell off. And as a result, there were no longer 2 options on the table. It was only one, and it was very, very, very easy at that point. And of course, that blew up the entire Conservative strategy, right? Because the Conservative strategy was to continue to confuse the people who didn't like Harper and force them to have 2 choices on election day. That didn't happen, and as a result, we have the government we do. I'd also be cautious about using the word liberal sweep. We spent the last 4 and so years listening to people who criticized or say that there was no legitimacy in the Harper government because they had only received 32.69% of the overall popular vote. I'm curious to see if the same number of people are just as passionate about the fact that Trudeau only received 32.47, a lower percentage of the popular vote than Harper did. But you notice we haven't heard any discussion about illegitimacy in the last few weeks. We haven't seen any national headlines, and I don't think we're going to until we start talking about alternatives to first past the post, and we'll get to that as we go along. In terms of whether this government is good for the North, I would agree with the statement that a minority government of any stripe, regardless of who it was going to be a problem for us. In particular, it was going to be a problem for us, but it would have been a problem for the country as we spent months messing around with who was going to be running the government, where the governor general fit in. Let's have another election. Is it 6 months? Is it 10 months? So a majority was the best possible outcome. In terms of some specific policy priorities of the Liberal government, I'm going to mention two before I get off the microphone and we have a broader discussion. But I will highlight this. Much like the Ontario Chamber, we looked at the party platforms against 32 policy recommendations that ourselves and the Mullet Centre put together that were good for the North. The best grade on that assessment was a C. The Liberals got it. So I guess from the perspective of you want the best student to actually get rewarded, the Liberals are in place. The reason they got a C, though, is because they got an F on just about every measure of policy that was important to Northern Ontario. They didn't talk about the Ring of Fire. They didn't talk about Federal. They didn't talk largely about infrastructure for mid-sized and small-sized cities. They didn't talk about regional clusters. All of these things are the issues that are important to us, and none of it was on the Liberal agenda when they went forward for the election. There are two things that I think should be highlighted in terms of very exciting changes. One is the approach of the Liberal government to First Nations and Aboriginal relations. I can't tell you enough about how important it is for a different perspective to happen in that relationship. What's good for First Nations and Aboriginal communities is good for the North, period, full stop. So when you look at the priorities that the Liberal government is listing, and you talk about they're going to get rid of the 2% growth cap on education spending, they're going to launch into a national assessment of murdered and missing Indigenous women, they're going to look at government-to-government relations for the North, or nation-to-nation relationships for the North. These are things that matter, and if they can deliver on them, if they're not just words, if they actually are actions, that's going to be good for the communities around us, for our friends and neighbors, and for us. The second thing I'll highlight is, I'm going to get into numbers again, the changes to the child tax benefits, an approach that we have in terms of supporting families going forward. It's true that with the elimination of income splitting, we still get penalized for families who keep one parent at home. So for example, if you look at a family with an $85,000 income and two kids, one person working, under the Liberal plan, they'll save about $105. If both of them are working, they'll save a little over $1,500. So we're still a little skewed to encouraging both parents to be in the workforce. That's a choice or not a choice, but that's a challenge, and that's a policy difference certainly between this government and the last one. But I think the more important thing about the Liberal changes on the child tax benefits is this. For a family with a total income under $40,000, they're going to get from the federal government an increase of $4,200. So that's a huge difference. That's a huge shift to focus the actual delivery of the money to the people who need it the most. And I think if you look at our population, particularly the fact that most of our children are in Aboriginal families with below average income, that's a huge boon to the overall system. And in fact, even our non-Aboriginal communities, particularly in the rural and mill communities, large percentages of our population are below the national average income. So I think both of those things are important going forward for our economic growth. And now,
thank you very much. So now we'll have the panel discussion followed by a Q&A from the audience. And we have some questions here, and I'm going to throw you off right off the bat. I'm not following script. And anyone who knows me will not be surprised by that. But as I'm listening to you all talking, something comes to my mind. The big question is, the theme of today's event is what's next. And I agree with that on a national level, like what's next. But I'm very partial to Northern Ontario. What's next for Northern Ontario, in your opinion? And I'll start with you, Charles.
so what's next for Northern Ontario? This government's going to spend a lot of time talking to First Nations, which means infrastructure questions, particularly addressing the issue around, and I know that they're talking about only a certain percentage of the overall infrastructure spend going to public transit. The fact is the vast majority of that infrastructure spend isn't going to have an impact here. And so we need, as northern communities, to be engaged in that conversation early and often, because we have infrastructure needs far beyond the Ring of Fire, although even the infrastructure that we invest in the Ring of Fire is about those 7 remote communities that would benefit from that. But the fact is, you can take a picture of the Trans-Canada going through any part of the north, and what is that old commercial? This is not your father's Oldsmobile. The Trans-Canada here doesn't look like the Trans-Canada in Southern Ontario. There are infrastructure needs here that mean, on a per capita basis, we need to spend more, and that's a tough sell when the voters aren't here.
Hendrik?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of getting the Northern Ontario issues on the agenda, that's going to be a challenge because there's so much coming up right away for this new government. Justin's agreed to go to 4 international events: the APEC Summit, the G20 in Turkey, the Commonwealth in Malta, and then off to the Paris climate change stuff. So there's a whole bunch of things happening right away on the international front. Secondly, they've got all of these things that they are going to try to ram through before December. So the middle class tax cut, that's coming right away. Whoever's the industry minister is going to announce the long-form census comes back. So for our perspective, the challenge has been how to get these issues out in front of a new minister. And so when you've got, say, a new minister of natural resources, and they're coming in for the first time, they're fresh, what are the big priorities? We have to get out there first with our agenda. And so the chamber, one of the benefits of the Canadian chambers, we're the biggest business organization in Canada. And so we could come out and say, look, there's some really great opportunities here. And if you want, as a new natural resources minister, to deliver some changes or an exciting win early on in your career, well, hey, we have some ideas for you. And in fact, just to take an example, there's a great resolution we have on innovation in mining. A lot of people think innovation is just about new apps on your smartphones and things, but innovation in mining and natural resources is spectacular. Look at how innovation changed the oil and gas industry in the States. Fracking transformed global markets and has completely revolutionized the oil industry. The innovation that's going on in mining is so important for our Northern Ontario, our communities, our mining industry. We don't think commodity prices are coming back anytime soon, so we have to innovate. I mean, the communities and mines in Sudbury are competing with an industry all over the world where wages are a lot lower, where environmental issues are not there. And so we've got this amazing resolution, actually from the Sudbury Chamber, that we passed at the last annual general meeting, saying we want mining innovation on the agenda. We want the federal government to invest in innovation in mining. And so these are the kind of things that we will go and advocate for at the Canadian Chamber to the new minister. And actually, so sometimes people think of the chamber network as there's Canada and the provinces, actually, and then the local chambers. It's flipped around. The local chambers tell us what to do. You've passed, the chamber community has passed this resolution, so now we're accountable to you guys. We have to go and advocate to get some money on mining innovation in Canada. So I think what it is really getting out in front of those ministers early and saying, we've got some great ideas to make changes, and we've got things we can work with you so that you show some wins early on. So,
Karl?
So further to that, one of the things the Liberals committed to was $200 million in sector-specific research and innovation. One of the sectors that they spoke about in that context was mining, so we're going to be holding them to account with regard to that. They also mentioned forestry, which will be positive for other areas of Northern Ontario. We are excited about that opportunity with those options. But when you look at it, a lot of the commitments that are made by the Liberals are going to be positive. They're going to positively affect this area as they roll out other areas of the country. So reducing the small business tax from 11% to 11 points to 9 points. I mean, a huge number of businesses, of course, throughout Northern Ontario are small businesses, and they will be positively impacted by that. You made points about what will be affecting middle-class families, and that will positively affect the North because it will give for people in the North more money that they will then put back into the economy here. It'll give them more capacity to do more things here in the North. So I think that those types of things will be positive for Northern Ontario.
Okay, and back to you, Charles. What do you think in the first 6 months, what will be the Liberal government's priorities?
Well, they've already listed them, haven't they? So the next 6 weeks are going to be spent gallivanting around the world talking about climate change, international trade, and various and sundry other things. And of course, that'll be a great opportunity for the current government to demonstrate at least a style difference from the past. Then the tax changes are the next priority. Getting the murder witness and Indigenous women is the next priority. I think that's it's going to take a little bit longer than most people would like it to take. They've already set the priority around dealing with the long-form census. The problem, of course, with that one is you have to act now. So hopefully the scan guys have already started to work, because the deadline for that's 10 weeks away before they have to actually get into the field. So
it's true. I think Charles is absolutely right, and I think they're going to move very quickly on a lot of these things. One of the great things about having a fixed election date was it was so helpful for the federal public service that they knew it was going to be coming in October 19th, and so the clerk of the Privy Council, Janice Charette, said to all the deputy ministers, she said, you better be ready to execute on day one, because we know this is coming. We know exactly what the party's platforms are, and so they had to have these agendas coming in, so that when the new Minister of the Environment shows up and says, hi, I'm here, I'm the Minister of the Environment, it's my first day, where's my office, where are the bathrooms? And they can say, he or she can say, we're going to Paris in 2 weeks, and I need a plan for a serious carbon reduction strategy. The public service can say, well, here it is, Minister, this is exactly what we need to do. And so basically, they've got all of the preparation done in advance so that they can move very quickly. I mean, in terms of long-form census and stuff, it's just the industry minister has to issue a memo. There's the tax legislation is ready to roll. So I think we'll see a whole flurry of early wins, because the Liberals are very keen. They've got this honeymoon. They need to show real results. The other thing we're pretty optimistic about, we're very happy about, is that they've shown that they're willing to listen. And that's so important for governments, particularly when you're in a minority situation. You've got a new cabinet, you've got really smart people advising you, but you have to be willing to listen, to reach out to the business community. That's so important. So we've met with a lot of the people, the Liberal government. Our CEO parent met with Mr. Trudeau, and we think they're really open and interested in the chamber agenda. That was really exciting for us in the election strategy, is that it's hard to get business issues in an election campaign sometimes, because they're not the most sexiest or most exciting issues. Sometimes it's more fun to talk about the leaders' personalities or their hair or whatever. And so business issues, getting them on the agenda, is a challenge. And so we had to come up with a platform that was really simple and straightforward. What are the 4 things you need to make your business run? You need capital, you need access to money. And so in terms of low taxes, in terms of funding, you need people. So the most skilled people, how do we get them into Canada? And this is the biggest challenge we've heard from businesses right across the country. You need access to markets. So not just the trade deals, but actually the infrastructure to get your goods to the markets. And finally, you need access to technology and innovation. And so we've got a whole suite of technology and innovation programs that we're recommending to the government. So we had a whole election strategy, and we were very lucky in terms of how the election played out, that there was a lot of focus on business issues. So I think what we'll see is a Liberal that are going to have to chalk up some wins fairly quickly, but that is quite willing to listen. We'll see so far.
Karl?
One of the issues that we've been following most closely at the Ontario Chamber is the pension issue. So I can tell you, since the Liberal government here in Ontario announced the ORPP, next to electricity pricing, it has probably been one of the most not well-liked policies that we've had to contend with. So we were very interested to see when Kathleen Wynne said that she would potentially take the ORPP off the table if the new Liberal government were elected because of their commitment to CPP enhancements. Following the election, she said she was going full steam ahead with the ORPP until such a time that it was clear that there would be a very specific path forward by the federal government, and she would not have to pursue the ORPP. Now, one of the commitments that the Federal Liberal Party made was that within the first 3 months they would convene a meeting of provincial leaders to discuss CPP enhancements. And I think that that's one of the things that we're going to be watching from the Ontario Chamber perspective very closely, because a 1.9% input cost that every employer would have to pay for salaries under $90,000 if they don't have an existing plan is huge and will have a major impact on the success of business in Ontario. So the potential for a CPP enhancement, taking that off the table, what impact that will have on employers and the changes that will come from that, we're watching very closely, because I can tell you, having traveled around the province this summer talking almost exclusively, people spoke to me almost exclusively about that issue. They wanted us to be lobbying harder against it. And so, Kathleen Wynne clearly wants to ensure that individuals are protected in their retirement, as is the responsibility of any government. However, it will be interesting to see how this issue plays out and if there will continue to be changes, because as it is, I fully anticipate that if implemented as is, it will have a net negative impact on the business community throughout this province.
Charles, question is, we've had a majority government for a long time. What are the lessons we learned from that experience? And can we learn from the Americans' experience of that you're in 2 terms and you're out? What are the benefits or the pitfalls of either or?
See, that's a devious way of asking about the electoral change that Trudeau has promised. But anyway, first off, we haven't had a majority government for a long time. Let's remember that Harper's first 2 administrations were minorities. So, you know, they took a long time to find their majority government. And let's just say that a large percentage of Canadians didn't particularly like this particular Prime Minister having a majority government, as they demonstrated on the 19th. That being said, it was fascinating to see that we're now using the strong, stable majority language to describe the Liberals. And I think this is starting to be called the sleeper issue of the election campaign. This promise that this was the last election, first past the post. I'm very concerned that we don't have a full and deep enough understanding of the potential alternatives. And we may jump just because we're tired or we have a sense that first past the post is the wrong way to go. You know, you talk about stable majority governments, you talk about coalitions, you talk about giving. You know, there was an example raised earlier, the idea that if we had a Liberal minority government with a left-leaning NDP, they would have been pushed to the left, much like Trudeau 1.0 was. And some people thought that was good, and some people thought that was bad. For Northern Ontario, don't get me wrong, if we went to proportional representation, I think we'd actually have more power. I think that largely, if you look at the experience of proportional representation across the globe, it accentuates the edges. It gives more power to small regions, it gives more power to focused voting blocks, it gives more power to smaller parties. And so if the Trudeau government delivers on that, then it's probably good news for us. The question is, do the benefits to us outweigh the costs? And I'm still not sold on that.
Yeah, the one issue that Trudeau has focused on, though, is not proportional representation, it's ranked ballot. And from my vantage point, the implications of those 2 electoral reform changes would be remarkably different. So proportional representation clearly would have the ability for smaller minority parties to strengthen their voice within the context of a larger whole, and would give people incentive to always vote for who they want. Now, ranked ballot would as well. However, my vantage point, it's a recipe for significant power for the Liberals in continuity. If you're right-wing, you rank Conservative, Liberal, NDP. If you're left-wing, you rank NDP, Liberal, Conservative. But the points, the way we work out, the Liberals would always do inordinately well because they would be seen as the centrist option by both sides of the political spectrum. That's very unfair, and I think would have a net negative impact on the health of our democracy going forward. So real reform, from my vantage point, would be proportional representation. Trudeau hasn't been talking about that. He's been talking about ranked ballot. And I think we should all be very cautious about what the long-term impact of that would be on future changes of government and the ability to easily change government. As it is, the Liberal Party, in its present form, naturally is well liked by urban and suburban areas of this country, more than perhaps some of the other parties. And given population growth in those areas of the country, the Liberals will already be naturally advantaged into the next few generations because of that. So, all this to say, I'm excited that Trudeau is talking about reform in this area. For wonks like perhaps us, that's the kind of stuff that we like to think about and talk about because of the potential for it to have a positive impact. However, I'm concerned about what the options Trudeau has been talking about will be, because I don't think that they will add to new voices necessarily being brought to the table in a way that they aren't presently.
Yeah, I think we have to differentiate, though, between what Trudeau personally talks about, which is the ranked ballot, and the promise of the platform, which was to put together a panel of experts to look at options. So I think you're right, absolutely. If we went to the ranked ballot, the Liberals win forever. Thank you very much. Go to proportional representation, the mix is a little bit different.
I think what was interesting is that he was very clear on it. He said, this is the last election under first past the post. But I think we're a little bit skeptical because, I mean, we've seen these referendums at the provincial level. And I think imagine you're the advisor to the Liberal Party saying, well, we've got this majority and we go for election, we'll probably get another majority, but we'd like to change the whole political system in Canada to make it less likely to bring in more. And Canadians don't really know it or like it except for political science wonks and NDP supporters. And so there's not a whole lot of political gains coming out of it. So what they'll probably do is have a referendum on some sort of proportional representation of a ranked balloting system that Canadians don't understand and lose the referendum and say, thank you, we've tried it, and Canadians don't want to stick with the first past the post. So sorry to be cynical, but I don't think there'll be any change to the electoral system in Canada anytime soon.
Well, that's exactly what happened in Ontario in 2011. Kathleen or Dalton Gintanan brought in the mixed member proportional system option as part of a referendum in the 2011 campaign. And I have no idea how to explain it because it was just convoluted and it was just designed to be so because McGuinty could have communicated that he had a commitment to electoral reform and people looked at it and said, what is this? And I think very importantly, no money was spent during that election campaign by any party really to educate the public about what this potentially profound change would mean for Ontario. So I wouldn't be surprised if he went down that road. However, he did say this would be the last election, so that was pretty, under the old system, that's pretty equivocal, but stranger things have happened in politics.
There is we cannot ignore the fact that Justin Trudeau is 42 years old. And as a new leader of a progressive country and a very well-respected country globally, how is his youth, his experience going to portray on a global, when you look at some of the other leaders, like I think Putin, but if you look at some of the other global leaders, how is he going to represent Canada with, do you think he can? Seriously, because I know on my daughter's Facebook pages, there's a picture of him bare-chested on a moose instead of a horse. Did anybody see that on Facebook going around? It was ridiculous, so how does he get past, and he has it, whether we like to admit it or not, this image of him being more movie star-ish than a serious political leader. Do you think that's a detriment? I guess that's the question.
So he and Putin can have a pose on, right? Shirtless?
No, I was going to say, it's funny. I think we've all had a chuckle about some of the international media. The Daily Show with Trevor Noah has this montage of all the different CBS, ABC, CNN, and from serious reporters with all the gravitas saying, Canada's elected a new prime minister, the very handsome, the strikingly good-looking. All this keeps going on about it. But you have to remember, in terms of your question, was it a detriment? Yes, at the beginning of the campaign, it absolutely was. I mean, he was viewed as a charismatic pretty boy with not a lot of substance to him. And so thank goodness for the long, for the Liberals' perspective, thank goodness for a long election campaign where he had the chance to go out and do 5 debates and to get to meet Canadians, because this perception of him as sort of superficial or handsome was, really, and the Conservatives were the ones driving that, the nice hair stuff. And so that was a huge disadvantage for the Liberals initially. It was an interesting question we were actually talking about at the office. Imagine if it was flipped around. Imagine if Justin Trudeau were a woman. How would that have played out in the media? Would it have been acceptable to say, oh, she's very beautiful, therefore she probably doesn't know very much? Or would it have been acceptable to say, oh, she's got nice hair? I think it would be viewed as terribly sexist, but because Justin Trudeau was a man, it was okay to really push this line that he was superficial or filthy. And in fact, in terms of what he's pushed out, I think there is a lot of intellectual depth there, and so we can talk about some proposals there.
Right, and he was paddling that canoe just for his health, right? No, he was playing on the same thing that they were criticizing.
Yeah, so I think back to other countries that have had successful, that have seen young and debatably attractive leaders swept into power. You think about Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and did it have a really profound impact on the ability of those countries to, did things change really when it comes to international relations, say for example under those leaders? Well, arguably yes and arguably no. However, it certainly didn't hurt them to be seen as young, charismatic, and be fully have a tremendous amount of support at home. It gave them the ability to move agendas both at home and internationally. They were seen as charismatic leaders. So I think Trudeau is in a line of a number of leaders throughout the past who have been able to capitalize upon their youth and perhaps the passion that they are seen to bring to the role, the idealism that they're seen to bring to the role, and has an opportunity to capitalize upon that in a way that perhaps previous leaders in other countries have done before him.
Just one more comment on that is that, because I've been following it very closely, most of those comments referring to Trudeau's looks came from male commentators and not female. So I just wanted to point that one out.
We're all very jealous.
So before we get too far down this rabbit hole, I want to make a more serious comment. We love to talk about governments as if they're one person, or countries as if they're one person, and that's just not the case. And in fact, I thought that the turning point for the whole just not ready debate happened about midpoint through the campaign when the Liberals released the costing of their platform. They released the costing of their platform in Ottawa while Trudeau was in BC. And who was sitting at the table? It was Ralph Goodall, it was John McCallum, and it was I can never remember her name. Anyway, she was former minister in the Dewar government in Manitoba. 3 serious, experienced people, and the message was very clear. He may not be ready, but we are. And I think on the international stage, that's the situation. He's got lots of experienced public servants to back him up. He's got all kinds of experience in cabinet. He'll be just fine.
And just one on the international, to come back to your question about international representation. I was talking to someone from the Canadian American Business Council. We were talking about how, does this really have a reset with relations with the United States? Is this going to be a big change? And one of the things that, we sometimes think of relations between Canada and the United States in terms of, does the Prime Minister get along with the President? And really, Mr. Harper's relations with Obama were a bit strained, but it really didn't matter because a lot of the government bureaucracies got along, and we did achieve a lot in terms of border integration and a lot of, softwood lumber deal. How will the United States interact with this new leader, Justin Trudeau? There are some challenges there. Firstly, he's pulling out of Syria and Afghanistan very aggressively. He said, we're out right away. That's going to be one of the first things. He's canceling the F-35 program. So if you're an American who's concerned about security issues and spending on national defense, this is a disappointment. There's going to be a big blow-up coming on the softwood lumber issue. We don't see how that gets resolved anytime soon. So that will be a big blow-up. So there are a lot of challenging issues there. It's nice to have this sort of new, fresh face, but sunny ways only get you so far. There's really tough issues there, particularly on the Canada-U.S. front.
That leads to my next question. They've said that Harper has governed from the top down. He needed to be in control. How do you see Trudeau's leadership style? How will it benefit the country? And again, I'll start with Charles, because you're right in my view here.
So generally, my answer to that is style doesn't equal substance, and I think that's true. In this situation, though, because of the overall angst and anxiety, both inside the public service and through society as a whole, both the controlling nature, we may see some pushback. At the very least, in the next 3 to 5 months, we'll probably see a lot more examples of visible openness. Whether it translates into actual change, I'm far more skeptical of. Let's remember that Harper wasn't the first Prime Minister to centralize power at the BMO. In fact, Trudeau 1.0 probably started the process, and Chrétien perfected it, and Harper learned to screw it up. Excuse my French. But
Charles, that's a great point, because actually Peter Mansbridge asked that very question to Justin Trudeau. He said, your father, Pierre Trudeau, was responsible for a lot of the centralization of power. And Trudeau said, well, that's why I want to be the guy to undo a lot of that. But we'll see. There's no reason to disbelieve him. But the challenge is you've got a whole new government, so 125 brand new members of Parliament, who may have not experience in front of cameras and who are going to be hit with tough questions for the first time. And you know, I think there's a challenge is you can't have 130 government spokespeople. You have to have a central message from the top. And that was the challenge for the Conservative Party. They had no message discipline. They had individual MPs saying crazy things about different social issues, or saying, well, we want to pursue an agenda on all sorts of things. And so one of the successes of Stephen Harper was pulling the Conservative Party to the center and establishing message discipline to say, these are the things that we as Conservatives can offer you. Don't be distracted by what else is going on. We have a clear message for you. And it's really hard to do that without being controlling. So everyone says that. Or Stephen Harper said he was going to be more open and let MPs do a lot more talking. But then there were the odd wild statements from MPs, and so was forced to control. We'll see if Justin Trudeau can actually resist the urge to control and tighten up on the MPs.
I'm going to jump back in here. I'm going to channel one of my mentors here, Peter LaPointe, and point out the fact that it wasn't always the case. Ministers used to be the voice of their ministry. They were the government spokesperson. We don't have to have just one person talking. Now, I understand that you have to control the loose lips on the whole ship and the larger kind of inexperienced people in the caucus. But the fact is, if we want the Westminster system of government to work effectively, ministers have to have real power and authority. We can't kind of hide the finance minister under the table when bad things happen, and send the foreign affairs minister on a trip around the country when a refugee crisis happens. They have to be given serious power, and that means that the Prime Minister has to step aside. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be tough.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of the notion that the governance style will change under Trudeau, simply because I don't know how you really very effectively measure that. One of the points that was made is that Harper had a centralized approach. Well, is the budget for the Prime Minister's office going to decrease? Will Trudeau have less staff, which would enforce the centralized messaging than Harper had? There will still be messages that will be distributed from the centre that MPs and cabinet members will be necessitated to, frankly, memorize and utilize. We saw that under Trudeau when he was in opposition. That's not going to change in government. One of the points that I saw on Facebook, something put out by a Conservative staffer, that was the number of members of the Conservative caucus who voted against whipped votes. The number of non-whipped votes under the Conservative government, or while the Conservative government was in power, was greater than previous governments. So, there's a whole bunch of different ways to evaluate it, and I think there will be a narrative that Justin Trudeau is doing things differently. The way in which you actually evaluate that, I'm very skeptical about being able to do that in any kind of a meaningful way. In the Westminster model, there will always be centralized control in the Prime Minister's office. That's how our system works. I'm curious to see how Trudeau will be able to demonstrate that is different under him than in other Prime Ministers.
Well, that leads to another interesting question, and it's not on my list here, but it comes to my mind. Charles is laughing already. I think Justin's first political statement will be the appointment of his cabinet, which is coming out today. And what do you think that political statement will look like? And I'll start with you, Hendrik.
Sure. Well, firstly, it's going to look completely different because 50% of the cabinet will be women, and there's going to be a lot more young people, a totally new tone to a government. And I think that's a big part of the change that people are craving is to sort of see a whole new bunch of new faces and young votes, and so I think that will be exciting right away. I think in terms of the messaging he's going to put out there, is he's saying, look, we're open, we're a whole new government, we're going to, a few early wins to sort of reverse some of the things that Mr. Harper advocated. But I think in terms of the tone, what he's looking for is to really show concrete signs of change. And you're absolutely right, the first sign of change is going to be this completely different cabinet. And he's got some really strong people, some really strong voices. So I think we will hear a lot more from cabinet ministers than we did under the previous government.
Yeah, actually, on the finance piece, I want to say I agree with you. I think Scott Bryson probably will be the finance minister. Atlantic Canada delivered big for him, one. Two, Scott Bryson has actually been in cabinet before. He's already 83. He's also a relatively young compared to a lot of other members of cabinet, or other members of that caucus. But it was very telling for me that Trudeau said in advance of the cabinet appointment that he was going to make it 50% women. He didn't just show up at Rideau Hall today with a cabinet that was 50% women, and people would have inferred from that 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 was a priority for him. But he went into it saying that this will be a cabinet that is 50% women. I think that that was an important communications distinction that has been the subject of some debate because he's going into it saying that it's going to be equal rather than just elevating folks that were capable and talented, of which perhaps 55% would have been women. So he's very much about style and communicating that style rather than just in actions demonstrating what his approach is. He's very capable in saying to you, this is what I'm going to be doing. And I think that's part of his success because he leaves nothing to curiosity. He's very much about communicating very directly what his objective and intention is. And even when that is the subject of some debate over whether or not that's the right approach. But he's also committed to ensuring that all areas of the country are represented, and he has a caucus that's made up such that he can do that because he has representation from all over the country. So that that will be, I think, welcome. Not unlike the previous governments. I mean, Harper had one MP from Prince Edward Island, and guess who was the cabinet for Prince Edward Island? It was the one MP that Harper had. So it's a balance that is not unfamiliar to prime ministers. Demographic differences, regional differences reflected there in that cabinet, and so perhaps there will be likely a broader reflection of the changing face of Canada. So many new Canadians who are reflected in Trudeau's cabinet. I wouldn't be surprised to see a very talented Afghani Canadian woman who was elected in Peterborough is a member of his caucus. So individuals like that who represent the changing face of Canada, and perhaps who Trudeau sees as being part of the important part of the Liberal base.
So that leads us to our next prediction. Ralph Goodall is a lock for cabinet. There you go, write that down. You heard that here last. He's the only Liberal member from. Again, I think we have to differentiate between style and substance, between perception and reality. There will be two significant differences between this cabinet and the ones that have come before. One, 50% women, so there'll be a lot more female faces. I think that's a good thing. The second thing will be, it'll be smaller. The question is how much smaller and whether it stays that way. Lots of cabinets start out small and end up big, just ask the former Prime Minister. The perception somehow that it's going to be younger or it's going to be more diverse than what has come before, I would take issue with. There were a lot of young people in Harper's cabinet. There were a lot of young people in Chrétien's cabinet. Even going back to Trudeau 1.0 and to Pearson, we've always kind of, well, Pearson's cabinet is a little older. So maybe we started with Trudeau 1.0. And the fact is that the last couple of cabinets have been reasonably diverse. As diverse as we like them, not necessarily. So again, that'll be a stylistic point as opposed to anything else. I will make one other observation though, which is kind of a little off. It goes back to the point you made about Sudbury being represented all the way across the board with Liberals. If in fact, as I predict, the federal minister or the northern minister comes from Thunder Bay, that's good news. Because we've got two experienced provincial ministers who have lots of time in the legislature, lots of time as ministers to give her advice and direction. Same thing applies if the minister comes from Sudbury or if the minister comes from Sault Ste. Marie or from Timiskaming. The fact is that because we've got a lot of provincial experience here, we have the ability as Northerners, as a Northern community, to have a lot more impact a lot more quickly because we have to play on those relationships. And despite the fact that we love to talk about, what the structure looks like, politics is about people. It's about those relationships. And the quicker that the chambers and the communities can encourage municipal and provincial reps to build those positive relationships with the new federal reps, the quicker our issues get on the agenda and dealt with. Be a piece of advice I'd like all of us to kind of take out of this room this morning.
Just quickly to build on Charles' point, we're going to go out and meet the new ministers and welcome them and to the extent they can and say, well, you've got a tough portfolio, you've got a lot of challenges ahead, but here are some solutions that the chamber has been talking about. So, absolutely, that is critical to get out early because a new minister has all these different options in front of them and all these different people reaching out to them. So it's important to get that chamber voice out right away.
It's interesting as well that when people talk about regional representation, everyone nods their heads, yeah, we're going to do that. And when we talk about gender representation, there's a little bit of an intake. Yeah, I guess it's about time. It's just an observation I've noticed in national media reports as well. is following through on that. Having said that, and talking about having a minister from Thunder Bay, which would be great for the North, and we do have a lot of experience here. Justin Trudeau seems to be a very close relationship with the Premier of Ontario, and I believe, based on everything I've read, that will have a very positive effect on Ontario. What is your opinion about that relationship and how it will affect the North?
Well, I made the point earlier about the changes to the retirement pension plan, and the automatic positive of that was that the federal government said that they would pay for the administration of it in terms of the collecting of the tax, collecting of the payroll. So, I mean, that's positive. But how long was it? I think 7 months that it took for after she became premier for Kathleen Wynne to meet with Stephen Harper. I mean, that doesn't do anyone any good to not have that conversation. And Harper made some time while he was in Toronto to watch a hockey game. You know, having that level of just the ability to come and meet, pick up the phone and talk casually is a net positive for Ontario. Kathleen Wynne rolled the dice and took a real gamble in terms of supporting Justin Trudeau as vehemently as she did when his stock was down, and now that stock is up. So, you know, that's potentially a payoff for Ontario. It remains to be seen. But one of the challenging things is we spend so much time in Toronto lobbying and doing advocacy to keep political staff at Queen's Park. And now one of the things that's going to have to happen is that Trudeau and all his cabinet ministers are going to have to employ hundreds of political staff. And I can bet you a lot of them are going to be coming from Queen's Park. Folks who we've been developing relationships with over the years, folks who have been working for the McGuinty and now Wynne government for the last 15 to 12 years. So they'll want a change of scenery, I'm sure. A lot of them will leave Queen's Park and go to Ottawa. That's probably a negative thing for Ontario because you're losing that experience that senior political staff have brought to the provincial government over a decade. So that's challenging for those of us who do a lot of work in advocacy because we have those relationships. You know, we'll now have them potentially in Ottawa, so that's good. But most of the work that we do is with Queen's Park, and we'll be losing those relationships. And perhaps there will be less talented, less experienced people who will be coming up to then work in Queen's Park, overseeing a lot of the issues that are important to us.
I have one more question from the panel, and then we'll go to a Q&A from the audience. And the question is, Trudeau is not an island. Absolutely he's not. He's more than another pretty face. Yes, he is. But the people behind the Prime Minister and the people behind the Liberal Party that crafted these policies, that crafted these the budget and crafted all of the map for the plan going forward. Who are they, and are they good? Are they good at what they're doing? Are they good strategists? Are they experienced people? Are we being led by good, experienced people?
His name is Gerald Butts. There you go. That's pretty much the straightforward answer for that. Now, the good news is that he and Trudeau have been friends for a long time, and they work very effectively together. If you like the direction that the province of Ontario has gone, that's principally as a result of Gerald Butts and the team that he had at Queen's Park when he was working for McGuinty. If you didn't like how the province of Ontario has performed over the last decade, you're in for an unpleasant surprise in Ottawa.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there is this new approach, but there's a lot of the old guard, the old liberals that are in senior advisor roles. So it's sort of a blend of old and new. I mean, I think where they are well advised, they've got a lot of experts in there. There's a lot of talent there, but we'll see in terms of really executing on some of these provinces. Coming back to something Karl said, I think the biggest challenge that Mr. Trudeau has is this. He said, we'll work with the provinces, we'll reach out to the provinces, we'll fix all this stuff with the provinces. This is really hard. We're going to have, in 3 months, all the provinces are going to come together and agree to a new way to run the pensions in this country, including Quebec. Really. This is tough stuff. And so Mr. Harper didn't have a lot of relationships with he didn't have the premier summits. And in some ways that worked well. It sounds weird, but it actually worked well. There was no incursion of the federal government on provincial jurisdiction for 10 years. No provinces had anything to complain about in terms of us treading on the education, the things that are important to provinces. And that was hugely successful in Quebec. One of the things that Harper doesn't get enough credit for is how weak the separate sovereignty movement is in Quebec. Remember, under the Liberals, it was a lot of fun to be constantly arguing about, with Stéphane Dion and Jean Chrétien, about how in provinces and the feds would get along together, why the feds were intervening in education and training programs and all that other stuff. That argument stopped. It was starved of oxygen because the Prime Minister the federal government did not get involved in provincial jurisdictions. And so you're opening up a whole can of worms that has all these sleeping dogs that have been lying dormant for 10 years are being woken up and poked. And so we'll see how well these relations go with the provinces.
Yeah, we give Paul Martin a lot of credit as being a very strong finance minister. However, he cut the Canada Health and Social transfers to the provinces in half while he was in power, and that's a big part of how he was able to balance the deficit in the mid-90s. Ask Mike Harris at the time what he thought of that. That was not very good for the provinces. And further to your point, one of the mantras of separatists in Quebec is that they want more power for the provinces. Cutting those social transfers to the provinces, which we have seen under Liberal governments in the past, is what gives fuel to the sovereignty movement in Quebec and gives fuel to an antagonism between the provinces and the federal government. So, Trudeau can demonstrate a willingness to speak to the provinces, and that's good. I can tell you, Kathleen Wynne is very good at speaking to the business community now. She doesn't always listen to what we're saying. Very good at listening to us. It remains to be seen. Just a further point to the specific question you had about the people around Trudeau. So it's Gerald Butts and Katie Telford, two folks who worked in the McGuinty government. The person who designed the policy is a guy named Matthew Mendelson, who also comes from that cloth as well. You must have worked with him with the Mowat Centre, if you don't work in the Mowat Centre, because he runs that, which is a...
Just for the record, all three of those people are highly accomplished and very smart.
And
it doesn't mean they're always right.
All of them are very highly accomplished, very intelligent, and we should all hope that the Prime Minister-elect has a sensible run, and in this case he does.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to go to you. I'm sure they've given you lots of points. I'm sure there's some of you out there who can't wait to challenge some of these comments. And we have a microphone here. Do we have anybody? Could you please stand and introduce yourself and then ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, Tom Price, and now that we've got to the business portion of the meeting, it's become obvious in the last year that the economy of the country and everything that happens within it is not dependent on government policy, but it's dependent on demand and supply. The oil industry misread that. The mining industry misread that. We're now shrinking in both those sectors. How do you see the government of Canada moving forward to get us back to recognition of where our economy evolves?
No, that's a great question, and that's actually the biggest challenge for Justin Trudeau. Actually, that is the biggest challenge right there. There's not sunny. I mean, we had a recession in the first half of 2015. We think the third quarter will go positive, but only modestly. And if we look ahead, out 2016, there's not a lot of good news on the horizon. If you look at Canadian consumers, their personal indebtedness levels, debt's now 163% of personal disposable income. So we've got a lot of debt. And the housing, even Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which the government debt lender, they're pretty optimistic on the housing market. They're saying of the 17 biggest urban centers, 15 of them have problems with homes being overpriced. So there's a lot of softness going on in the consumption sector. On the export side, we hear all about oil and gas all the time, but it's right across the commodities that prices are really soft, and we don't see them coming back anytime soon. One of the challenges is that this is international phenomenon. It's not something that we've done domestically. When people ask what's going on with commodity prices, what they're really asking is what's going on with China. China consumes 50% of the world's nickel, 49% of the world's iron ore, 34% of coal. So what's going on in China is really driving commodity prices. And so China's going through this really tough slowdown in their economy. So what we're seeing, our estimates at the Chambers, we're seeing oil prices recovering to somewhere around $60 by the end of 2016, but softness in the commodity prices right across the board. And so that's why I think one of the great parts of the campaign was that you see was a lot of it was about the economy. And we had this, it was really fascinating debate where, so poor Prime Minister Harper drops the writ of election, and 3 weeks later Statistics Canada says, yeah, actually we're in recession. And so then there was this debate that came out, well, what do you do about a country in recession? Should you be stimulating? Should you be spending all this money on infrastructure? And so Mr. Trudeau said, well, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to run deficits of about 10 billion for 3 years in order to stimulate the economy. That's not enough to really do a whole lot in the economy. So I think one of the challenges for him is certainly these expectations are so high that Justin Trudeau is this new guy, the golden boy that's going to help. But if next year we're running deficits and the economy is still very weak, I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment. So yeah, that's definitely going to be a big challenge, and the economy is going to be the biggest problem for Canada in the years ahead.
Yeah, one of the things I think, this is, I'll come back to your question, one of the things I think that Kathy Wynne has gotten really right is that our greatest resources are people, and we have to think of programs and initiate policies that make investments in the ability of individuals to capitalize upon their natural talents, get an education, be trained, be able to take risks and be in an environment where they can take risks, they can innovate in a way that they hadn't before. So I'm really happy to see that some of those people that have been around her are now around him, because that's what it's going to take to get out of a period of slow growth, is for people to be in an environment where they have the training, they have the education, and they feel supported to be able to take those risks and then grow our economy. So things like what Trudeau introduced, which is $200 million in terms of investments in sector-specific research and innovation, that will stimulate, I think, a new way of doing business for a lot of people in terms of relevant and important sectors in the Canadian economy. That's what it's going to take to get out of slow growth. There's going to be taking risks for Canadians to be taking risks in a way that they haven't in the past. In terms of the stimulation of the economy that would come through infrastructure, Harper said that he would be increasing infrastructure investments from, I think, 60 billion to 84 billion. Trudeau was going to be increasing it to 125 billion. So the space between what we would have gotten from stimulus between the two is about $3 billion a year over the course of 10 years. Not very significant. But as you say, it's going to take a lot more than that to have a meaningful impact on the ability of the Canadian economy to create jobs as a result of government investments. So slow growth in the foreseeable future, but it's going to be taking those kinds of programs that enable people to think broadly about what the opportunities before them are.
So let's be clear on a couple of things. One, 2% growth is the new normal. And in fact, some would argue it's a return to normal, that in fact, the 8, 9, 10% growth that we saw was the aberration. I'm not entirely sure that's true. In fact, I suspect that the next spike will happen if and when Africa starts to grow and create a middle class. I suspect that many of those countries are going to be the next BRICS. That being said, the BRICS still haven't fully evolved, and China's still got lots of space to grow. So I think there's lots of potential going forward. From a government perspective, in terms of what they can do, if you're talking about commodities, remember it's a boom-bust cycle. And so it's pretty clear that right now is the time to invest in infrastructure. I don't think we're investing in infrastructure to stimulate the economy today. As 2 friends to my right have pointed out, we're not spending enough money to do that. But we can invest in infrastructure that's targeted to put us in a position to take advantage of a commodity boom and a service boom when it comes. So that means things like investing in increased infrastructure in areas where we don't have it, which is pretty much everywhere in the north. The Liberals have a commitment to a digital strategy for Canada. That's marvelous. I'm very excited about that. Here's the problem. The largest geography and the largest population base that's not regularly serviced with reliable high-speed internet is here. So how much money are they going to spend on their infrastructure dollars and their digital commitment to make us part of the global digital economy? How much money are they going to spend to address some of the infrastructure barriers that kept us from taking advantage of the last commodity spike? It wasn't that the chromite in the Ring of Fire wasn't attractive, it was that it wasn't available to us. Now's the time to spend. Let's stop dicking around about who's got $1 billion and when we're going to spend it, and actually put a plan together and start spending it. Get the roads in place, get the rail lines in place, get the telecommunications infrastructure in place, and then innovators and entrepreneurs like the people in this room will take advantage of it. You can't just assume that companies are going to be able to pay the freight on all of the infrastructure to sustain it. That's not how we built the economy in Southern Ontario. It's not how we built the economy in the country, and it's certainly not the model of how we built a global economy. So we invest in infrastructure to give access to markets to the people who see the opportunities and can take them, and not make them wait 3 or 5 years and the opportunity's gone. I think that's what government has to do. And frankly, if I could make a deal with this government now to say, you guys don't take credit for any economic growth and we won't criticize you for the failure to grow the economy, done, I'll take it. It'll never happen. But the fact is the government does not have the capacity. They don't create jobs. Well, they hire some people directly, but they don't create jobs. They don't have the role in the economy that we like to pretend they do. And we give them credit when it's good, and we slam them when it's bad. And the fact is, neither one of those are their responsibility. And I bet you probably agrees with that.
No, but Charles, that's a really good point. But that was one of the most interesting debates in the election, where the economic orthodoxy is you should pull back on the government. The government should shrink the size of the government, lower taxes, and give the private sector the room to flourish and to grow. And these are of course the themes that have been very near and dear to the hearts of certainly us at the Chamber of Commerce. And one of the arguments that Justice Trudeau and the Liberals were making is to say, no, wait a second, guys. Family incomes have been basically stagnant for the past 20 years. Income inequality is rising because technology and trade is pulling out the wages at the high level and is pulling down the unskilled wages. And so we have this really hyper-competitive global environment. And he says it's precisely in that environment that you need government to intervene and to lift people up, to provide more training, to help companies in certain sectors. And so this is an interesting theoretical debate, but what does it actually mean when the rubber hits the road? And I think one of the most interesting questions we'll see early on the next few months is Bombardier, where the Quebec government has offered $1 billion to Bombardier with loans to help them through this tough spot. The C series, which has been played multiple times. Will the feds come through with multiple,
bold predictions, yes. They're going to get their $1 billion.
But will we see a more interventionist role of the government in the economy? So it's interesting.
Well, let's take a step back and stop talking about the narrative and start talking about the facts. The fact is that the previous government wasn't non-interventionist. They spent a lot of money tweaking the levers of economic power. And the simple fact is, the question is, did it work or did it not work? And so the fact that this government is talking about changing the way they focus those kind of things, talking about local opportunities, talking more about targeting and testing and assessing whether or not interventions are working, I think is making a lot of sense. I spent a good part of the last 10 months traveling around Northern Ontario talking to people about training programs, preparation for the Ring of Fire, and I can't tell you the number of conversations I had where people were telling me they were on their 3rd training program and still didn't have a job. How much money are we wasting? How much of their time are we wasting training them for jobs that aren't going to exist for 10 or 15 years?
No, that's a really good point. And that was one of the things. So unemployment insurance premiums, so they're quite high. And the federal government's been having these huge surpluses of about $3 billion per year because they collect much more in employment insurance than they actually pay out. And EI, like as you were saying about pension premiums, it's a payroll tax. So it's a tax on your hiring. So we think this should be lowered because employment insurance should pay for some insurance. If you or I lose our jobs, we have that. So a lot of this gets diverted to training programs. The training programs are wonderful, but they're given out to the provinces without a whole lot of accountability and assessment of what's actually being accomplished. Would you spend $100,000 or $200,000 without checking what were the results? Did this work or not? So that's our concern about, God bless the provinces, but they get billions of dollars of training programs, and there's not really an assessment at the federal level. Is it accomplishing what it's supposed to? And so the promise now is that there's going to be an extra $500 million of training programs going out to the provinces. We're saying, my goodness, we already spent $2 billion. We're going to now spend $2.5 billion. With very little accountabilities. But that's the question about federal-provincial relations. Will Justin Trudeau stand up and say, we want to see the results of the provinces, because I promise you the provincial premiers will not like that at all.
Can I ask a question? So, we use the word sweep a lot in the preparatory notes that you have in your hand there. Liberal sweep, liberal sweep, liberal sweep. I'm an Atlantic Canadian by trade. By birth. I remember 1996 and 1997. In 1996, the Liberal government changed the rules for employment insurance, made it more difficult to get, reduced the benefits. What happened in 1997, there was an election, and then you talk about sweeps, the Liberals lost every seat in Nova Scotia and almost every seat in the Maritimes. I think they hung on to a couple in Newfoundland. This Liberal government, this new Liberal government, has talked about a national plan for employment insurance to get away from the fact that large swaths of people in Ontario, unemployed people in Ontario, are not eligible for benefits. How aggressive do you think they're going to be on that? And what will be the impact in 5 years from now?
Well, they've been very specific in terms of how they're going to be decreasing the premium, right? So I think they gave an exact cent number. So right now it's 1.88 cents for 40 EI for every $100 of income. And it's going to be released to by, I think, to 1.68 cents or something like that, 1.65 cents. So we know that that's coming. But they have spoken in elusive terms about how they are going to be trying to take away the discrepancies that exist in terms of, so when you apply for employment insurance, the amount that you get and how long you are eligible for depends upon where you are in the country to a large degree, as well as other factors. But where you are in the country is an important piece of that. And Ontarians are disadvantaged in a very big way. So if you're going to make it more advantageous for Ontarians, you're taking it away from other areas of the country. So I think there will probably be a political calculation. If Trudeau looks at it and says, okay, we make this change, we go from 32 seats in Atlantic Canada to 30, can we live with that? I bet he can. But if he thinks he's going to be decimated, then no. Because the truth is that for a lot of areas of Ontario, we are going through some hard times, but it's not as challenging as other areas of the country. So EI changes are not going to make a massive change in terms of the intentions of the electorate here, I'm guessing, in the next election, whereas they may in more challenged areas of the country like Atlantic Canada. All of that being said, this is where we hope having a person like Kathleen Wynne being such a strong advocate for Trudeau from the early days will come in handy to say that we need to support individuals in Ontario who are out of work. We're still not through the downturn that inordinately affected us versus other areas of the country. So you need to be able to make it more advantageous, the EI program for Ontarians. This is where I'm hoping she'll be able to come to the table and be a true advocate for Ontario, because it's a very important issue.
First of all, I'd really like to thank the Chamber for bringing you people here together today. I think it's something we have to do more of. I'll get right to the question. Prime Minister-elect, or almost Prime Minister, Trudeau has promised a new nation-to-nation relationship with Canada's Aboriginal people. What do you think this means, and how will this impact processes such as resource development in the nation? I've got a couple of corollaries if you could touch on it. If and when they get to this, because I think tokenism is something that goes beyond just a female thing. I think it works with the Aboriginals as well. Is there an opportunity in these discussions to develop some sort of relationship or template for dealing with the natural resources? I think discussions have to be a two-way street. And thirdly, how would you suggest they proceed?
Well, a new relationship, I think, with the First Nations communities could make it a lot more difficult or a lot more easy in terms of resource development. Before this conversation started, we talked about how, despite all the bravado, Prime Minister Harper didn't actually build 1 kilometer of pipelines in this country during his 10 years in office. Now, one of the reasons for that, I actually saw an interesting panel with Chantal Hébert a few years ago, where she said Trudeau would be in a much better position to build pipelines in this country because there wouldn't be an automatic distrust that he would be negatively impacting the environment. People would say, well, I would presume that Trudeau would have gone through the right environmental processes. And I think the same can be said of Trudeau and his ability to capitalize upon our natural resources, as well as in terms of developing relationships with the Aboriginal communities. Because there will be an automatic trust, I think, a natural trust that will be at the table during those conversations that perhaps wasn't there under the previous government. That being said, if the processes that he develops and puts in place are so rigorous that it becomes difficult for natural resources companies to develop and to mine, then who knows how difficult it will be. But I think there will be a natural trust that will come into those conversations in a way that there hadn't been previously.
I wanted to talk about the corollary question about templates we can learn from. The Chamber released a report about 3 months ago called Aboriginal Edge, and there are some companies that are so good at working with the Aboriginal communities, that have Aboriginal employees, Aboriginal management, that have really succeeded and have done really well. And there's a lot we can learn from some of the models that are working well. Because, as you say, it's not enough to get license from Environment Canada. You have to get the social license from these communities right across the country. And if you're not credible, if you haven't done the consultations, if they don't feel that that really their environmental interests and their community's interests are protected, any community right along, a pipeline that stretches all across the province, any community anywhere along that can block the whole project. And so that's why it's so important to have these models. And what we've heard from our members is we want federal leadership on a lot of these things, because the way it's worked now is it's just whether it's a pipeline company or mine, just go figure it out with the communities, and once you figure it out, let us know. So then the question is, what's the role of what are the roles of all these different communities? Do you have to satisfy each one? Do you have to satisfy 60% of the people, or 80%? Or what if some part of a community is upset or doesn't feel even satisfied? What are some of the rules and guidelines around that? And so we'd love more structure and assistance with this from the federal government, but you have to have that credibility as Carl says.
So from a nation-to-nation perspective, I think we have two examples to go from. The federal government has two examples to go from. They have the Ontario example and they have the Quebec example. Both started from the exact same place where Trudeau is now, saying all the right things, talking about nation-to-nation relationships, talking about respect, talking about blending of the cultures, talking about all of that balancing exercise. The difference is that in Quebec, they actually put rubber on the road. They put in place decision-making bodies that actually gave First Nations and Aboriginal communities power and decision-making. They gave them money, they gave them influence, they gave them a position, they gave them a voice. We talked about all of that in Ontario, and then we very quickly blew it up yet again. For example, the development corporation that we set up for the Ring of Fire. We promised that was going to be a mechanism to give them voice and influence over what was going to be spent, and then we turned around because we had set an artificial political deadline, and we set it up without discussion with them and with no power and influence. And what happened? They immediately jumped off the bandwagon. We ended up with 4 different First Nations groups opposing that entity, not because they thought it was a bad idea, but because they weren't included. And so to the extent that he's going to move nation to nation forward in a real way, then he's got to look to BC, he's got to look to Quebec. He can't follow the model here because, frankly, this province has probably got the worst record of all the provinces in dealing with this issue.
Just as a layperson, my name is Cynthia McKenzie, and given where we are today in this country, with this new government coming into place today, over the next 4 years, do you think the country will be in a better position or a worse position in the future?
I think firstly, the country needs a little bit of change. And I think certainly the investments in infrastructure, the things that the Liberals have promised are broadly, well, I think they're broadly positive for Canadian business. We're optimistic about the big investments in infrastructure. We're optimistic about some of the things they've signaled on innovation and technology. So we think on balance, we're pretty happy with the agenda with the new government, that their agenda generally is pro-business. The other thing we liked is that Mr. Trudeau was very clear on corporate taxes. When he was giving this famous speech about raising taxes on the 1%, a very populist issue, he said, some people say we should raise corporate tax rates. Here's why we can't. And here's why we should, because it would hurt investment, because it would hurt ability to hire. So it was a very, very pro-business message. And so we think this is a pro-business government with a good agenda. So we're generally pretty happy.
Yeah, given that he has a majority, he has very little restricting him from accomplishing these lofty goals that he has set for himself. And so, when I think about things in terms of democratic values that he's been communicating around, they're positive. He's saying the right things, more openness, an openness to looking at electoral reform, an openness to looking at the Senate. These things are fundamental to the success of our democracy. And so we're excited to see the shape of those conversations. Economically, we are in a period of slow growth, and so there's some things happening outside of his power, things happening internationally, but he is interested in empowering the middle class. I mean, there'll be real changes that are made to give more money back to the middle class at the expense of more wealthy Canadians. So that's good if you're in the middle class, and most people are in the middle class. So I think at the end of the 4-year cycle, the people that are in the middle class say, yeah, that was great, I really enjoyed that. But the impact on some more wealthy Canadians, many individuals who own and operate businesses in this country will perhaps be more negative, especially if payroll taxes are increasing. So we're watching that with some caution. Then, so democratic, financial, but then social values. And I think that he is coming into this role with more compassion and more attention to be paid. One of the things we haven't spoken about in over an hour now really is healthcare. And we're coming toward a massive challenge as it relates to demographic crunch that's coming. And that issue didn't really come up in a profound way on the electoral campaign. But I think the ability of this government to deal with the oncoming expense that will need to be made to ensure that our healthcare system is able to respond to what's coming will be very important in telling of their ability to be successful. We think about healthcare in this country in a way that's almost religious. But we don't realize that there are countries that are more socialist than Canada that have more opportunities for private sector engagement in the healthcare system, like France, and they have more success in terms of the way that they run their healthcare system. So I think that this is an issue that is, of the provinces, but also of the ability of the federal government to provide leadership on this issue, because I think it's going to be one that's profound and only increasing in terms of its importance and ability for Canada to be successful.
I think 4 years from now we're going to be better off. It's going to have nothing to do with the current government or whether it would have been somebody else. I think the global trends are far larger than anything that one individual government or one individual country can do. Are we going to be exponentially better off? No. We're going to see the 1.5–2% steady growth. I think that's going to translate into increases in disposable income. I think we're going to see a closure of the gap around income inequality. I think we're going to see continued attacking against poverty and disease across the globe, and that's going to have a positive result. And the fact is, the better off that we can make other countries, the better off we become, because there's more people to sell our goods to, and trade and services, and that kind of thing. We talk about the middle class, but by definition, the middle class is always going to be the largest block, right? It's the 50% in the middle. So how do you not be? Like, I suspect everybody here is probably in the middle class, although I suspect there's probably maybe 25 or 30% of us who are in the 1%, because it's easy to get into 1% in Canada, right? All you have to do is work for the public sector. So yeah, I think we're going to be better off, and that's pretty much the answer.
Sorry,
Closing remarks, starting with Hendrik.
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. Just quickly to build on Charles' point. One of the reports that are coming out, we're looking. We have a crystal ball, sort of our outlook for business in Canada and big changes ahead. This year, one of the themes is going to be the future of work, because there are big changes coming. We look ahead 4 or 5 years. Remember, January 1st, it's going to be legal for driverless cars in Ontario. They are already driving in Nevada. Think about what a transformational change this is going to be. If cars could drive themselves. If you landed at night, by the way, in an airplane at Pearson, probably it was the autopilot that carried you in. But imagine how, firstly, efficient it would be to have all our public transport being driven around by robots, perfectly on time. Imagine how much transportation costs would fall when trucks are driven automatically by robots. But what are we going to do with all those people who drive taxis, all those drivers? Are we going to retrain them to program web pages? There's big changes coming to every single work sector in the world, whether it's even certain middle management, office work to. There's an estimate by Oxford that 40% of jobs could be replaced with technology over the next 25 years. So there's big changes coming for the world. So what we have to make sure is that Canada is the most innovative country in the world, that we have this incredible business environment, because that's the way that we'll succeed and produce the prosperity. But anyways, thanks you so much for having us, and thanks for getting up early early.
I'm going to jump right in here and say it's good news that 40% of the jobs can be replaced by technology, because here in Northern Ontario, the demographic shift means that in the next 20 to 25 years, we're going to lose 40% of our workforce. So we're going to need the computers to drive the cars because there isn't going to be anybody to drive the bus or push the broom or turn on the lights here. Nice.
Yeah, just in closing, I would say, despite the sunny ways that we're now expecting under Trudeau, and especially a sunny day, Ontario and Canada's businesses face increasing global competition. We have a lot of challenges. Some have been addressed here today, some have not. So from a business advocacy perspective, I would encourage everyone here through your chamber to continue to be vigilant, to hold government to account. Be cautious and wary of increases to payroll input costs because they will have a profound effect on the ability of business to be successful. But there is a lot of optimism, and I hope that we can hold on to that optimism as long as possible, but don't let that take away from the need to consistently hold this government to account. And I think that if we do that, if we stay on our toes and act as a strong voice here for Northern Ontario, from my vantage point for Ontario, we will see success, we will see this government deliver for us, because we, on election day, delivered for them.
Hendrik, Karl, Charles, thank you very much for volunteering to be here today. It was very informative. A round of applause for our guests, please. As a token of appreciation and acknowledgement of the three of you joining us today, the Chamber will make a donation in each of your names to our Greater Sudbury Chamber of Commerce Post-Secondary Student Award Fund. The monies collected in this fund in recognition of speakers like you who address our gatherings will be distributed equally at the end of the year in the form of a bursary to each of our 3 post-secondary institutions. So thank you very much. For information on upcoming events, you can visit the Chamber's website at sudburychamber.ca or give us a call. And I'd like to thank the Chamber for organizing this. The background information you provided was excellent. You guys did a fantastic job, so thank you very much. And you know what? We're enjoying a sunny day today. Let's all bask in the sunshine of a new political era, but let's not forget as well that we have a responsibility in our communities to make sure that we are heard, that we're stood up, that we stand up for what we believe in, and we get our share of the wealth, because we give more than we get here in Greater Sudbury. Thank you very much.